The surface of the Pacific broke with a sharp, clean snap. Isabella Cruz submerged, the cold pressure of the deep water rushing over her. She navigated the dark, silent currents, limbs moving with practiced efficiency. Minutes later, she hauled herself onto the research vessel, water streaming from her body. The deck was loud. Her crew shared jokes, their laughter echoing against the steel hull. But Isabella did not join them. She walked past the shouting voices and entered the cabin. She ignored the open charts on the central table and reached for a worn, spine-cracked business journal. While her peers analyzed sonar pings and biological samples, Isabella traced the intersection of marine data and scalable market models. She sat in the corner, the only quiet space she could claim, and turned the page. The ship pitched in the swell, but she did not look up. She was not interested in the fish they were studying. She was interested in the mechanism behind the research itself. She marked a paragraph, looked at the horizon through the porthole, and began to calculate. Dawn arrived with a dull gray light that filtered through the cabin window. For 10 years, this hour belonged to no one but Isabella. She sat in the same chair, the silence of the early morning acting as her only witness. She started with basic fish anatomy, memorizing structural patterns and migratory habits until they felt like instincts. Then, she shifted focus. She turned the pages toward market psychology, dissecting how choices were made and why value shifted. She moved from the biological to the behavioral, mapping the logic of the ocean onto the logic of trade. She tracked every insight in a ledger, building a private library of connections that no one else on the vessel could see. Her peers arrived on deck, bleary-eyed and clutching coffee, but she was already deep into her second volume of the morning. She did not skip a day. She did not wait for motivation. The habit was her anchor, a rigid structure in a life spent drifting across uncertain tides. By the time the sun fully breached the horizon, she had finished another chapter, closed the book, and stood up. She was ready. The team hovered over the plotting table, their fingers tracing the jagged lines of the sea floor. They spoke in terms of depth, salinity, and migration counts. Isabella stood at the edge of the circle, watching them work. They saw only the biology of the ocean, a closed system of facts and figures. She watched their hands move across the charts, noting how they ignored the economic implications of every discovery. When the lead researcher pointed to a cluster of data, he spoke of environmental impact, not the scalability of the technology required to capture it. Isabella pulled her notebook from beneath a stack of printouts. She cross-referenced their findings with the market models she had studied at dawn. The gap was clear. Where they saw a specimen, she saw a supply chain. Where they measured current speed, she measured the efficiency of potential power grids. They were looking at a map of the world. She was looking at a map of the future. She kept her silence, watching the crew argue over minor data discrepancies. She tucked her pen away, turned her back on the table, and walked to the window. The ocean was not just a research subject. It was a market waiting for an architect. The board meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. The lead researcher walked back onto the ship, his face pale, holding a thin folder that had been returned unopened. He dropped the report onto the central table. The pages slid, hitting the edge of the charts they had spent months perfecting. The lead investor had been blunt. He called the research technically accurate but commercially invisible. There was no funding. The rejection rippled through the crew. Some sat on the benches and stared at the floor, while others began gathering their gear. The silence of the room replaced by the sound of equipment being packed away. The project was over. Isabella stood by the porthole, watching the waves. She listened as the crew debated who was to blame, their voices rising in frustration. She did not join them. She did not offer comfort. She watched the lead researcher crumple the rejection notice and throw it into the waste bin. The tension in the cabin was sharp, heavy, and absolute. They were adrift without a map, without a budget, and without a purpose. Isabella turned away from the window, her pulse steady. She looked at the abandoned, failed report, then at the empty seat where the lead researcher sat. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, and for the first time, she saw the path forward. The cabin remained thick with the scent of stale coffee and defeat. Isabella walked over to the waste bin. She reached in, pulled out the crumpled rejection notice, and smoothed the pages against the metal surface of the table. The crew did not notice. They were too busy packing their personal belongings into heavy bags. She spread the report flat. She took her notebook from her bag and laid it open beside the discarded findings. Her pen hovered over the blank white paper. She looked at the data points that the investors had dismissed as useless. She looked at the market psychology notes she had scribbled in the margins of her morning reading. The connection was not a sudden epiphany. It was a mechanical alignment of two separate systems. She began to draw a flowchart, linking the tide cycles they had measured to the infrastructure requirements of coastal cities. Every line she drew increased the pressure. If she missed a single variable, the entire bridge between science and profit would collapse. She did not look up. She did not speak. She pushed aside a stack of useless maps to make room for her calculations. The room was noisy with the sounds of departure, but she was already miles away, anchoring her future to the intersection of her research and the world outside. Isabella worked with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. She crossed out every reference to academic methodology, replacing jargon with clear, transactional language. She tore a page from the journal, crumpling it and tossing it aside. It was a relic of a failed approach. She replaced the dry descriptions of marine life with a precise map of scalable technology applications. Her pen moved across the paper, carving out a new path that bypassed the traditional constraints of research funding. She calculated return percentages alongside oxygen consumption rates. She drafted a structure that addressed market risk, not just biological variables. Her handwriting changed, becoming sharper, more angular as the proposal took shape. She was no longer asking for money to observe the sea. She was proposing a system to monetize the data it provided. She stapled the final pages together, the metallic click echoing in the quiet cabin. She stood up, the notebook held tight in her hand. The research had been transformed into a business asset. She looked at the stack of discarded academic drafts in the bin. They were now obsolete. She had successfully bridged the gap between the lab and the boardroom, and for the first time, she saw the logic of a fortune taking shape on the page. Isabella walked into the boardroom. The air was cool, smelling of filtered water and expensive coffee. She placed the stapled proposal on the mahogany surface. The lead investor did not look up immediately. He flipped through the pages, his thumb tracing the charts where marine data met revenue projections. He paused at the third page, his brow furrowing as he compared the biological cost analysis to the projected market growth. Silence filled the room. The other investors sat motionless, watching his reaction. He tapped the desk twice, his finger landing on the bottom line summary. He looked up, caught Isabella's gaze, and pushed the document toward his assistant. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a fountain pen, and uncapped it with a sharp, metallic snap. He signed the bottom line without asking a single question. He slid the contract back across the polished wood. Isabella took the pen, signed her name, and stood. The deal was done. She walked out of the building and into the sunlight. The validation of her years of reading hit with the weight of reality. She did not celebrate. She checked her watch, calculated the next steps for the project, and started walking toward the subway. The fortune had begun. The contract was only the start. Within months, the office expanded from a single desk to a global network. Isabella moved through airport terminals with the same focus she once used to study tide charts. She stood at a gate in Singapore, her phone pressed to her ear, listening to a project manager describe a supply chain failure. She paced the length of the boarding lounge, eyes scanning the departure board while she dictated a solution based on a logistics principle she had read about in a management biography. She ended the call, sat in a plastic chair, and immediately opened a thick volume on international trade law. Her world became a series of hotel rooms, each one a temporary base. She unpacked her books first, lining them up on the desk before plugging in her laptop. She analyzed communication techniques while the city lights flickered outside her window. Every flight delay was an opportunity to finish another chapter. She worked through the night, cross-referencing market data with the strategies she had absorbed on planes. The company surged upward, scaling with a speed that startled her competitors. She did not look at the bank balance. She looked at the growing stack of books. Her curiosity was now a machine that required constant input, and she fed it with every hour she could claim. A young student waited in the lobby of her office, clutching a notebook. He approached her as she walked to the conference table, his question ready. "Which book, Isabella? Which one made you a millionaire?" He waited for a title, a secret, a singular key to open the door. Isabella stopped. She did not answer immediately. She turned to the wall of her office, where 500 volumes stood in tightly packed rows, their spines worn from constant handling. She walked over and ran her fingers across the collection, hearing the dry friction of paper against paper. She pulled one volume from the center, opened it to a random page, and read a single paragraph aloud. It was a dry technical excerpt on market fluctuations. She closed the book and slid it back into its place. She turned to the student, who still held his pen poised to write down a title. She shook her head. There was no single volume. There was no magic index. She pointed to the entire wall, to the sheer volume of paper and ink, and held her gaze until the student lowered his pen. The shortcut he sought did not exist. Every page, every chapter, every hour of reading had been a brick in the wall she had built. The student looked at the shelves, seeing them for the first time not as a collection of answers, but as a map of years. The student left, the office door clicking shut behind him. Isabella walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the Pacific churned against the pier, the same dark water she had dove into years ago. She watched the rhythm of the waves, the way each one built upon the surge of the last. She spoke to the empty room, her voice low. Wealth was never the goal, she explained to the glass. It was merely the byproduct of the pages. Each day, she had fed her curiosity, turning it into an engine that pulled opportunity toward her. The money, the status, the global network, those were the wake left behind by the ship, not the ship itself. She turned back to the desk. The surface was clear, save for the single volume she had been holding. She sat down, her posture straightening, and cleared her mind of the morning's interruptions. She reached for a new book from the stack, the paper crisp and clean under her touch. She opened it to the first page, the spine cracking softly in the quiet. She lowered her eyes, focused on the first line, and began to read. The cycle started again, one word at a time, moving forward with the same steady, relentless momentum that had defined her entire life.